Okay, welcome everybody. I'm Joni Kinwall Moore, and I'm one of the co-founders of North American Millets Alliance, along with Jonathan Landick and Dr. Jonathan Landick and Dr. Don Osborne. And I am on the road today from sunny, beautiful Washington State, actually going through some of the areas that we are running Proso Millet trials, which is kind of fun. And today we have a fantastic speaker joining us for our second International Year of Millets webinar. I am so excited to introduce Dr. Abed Chaudhury. He is working on incredible things in the space of climate mitigation, soil health, and genetics. And he is an expert on millets and the history of millets. And so I want to thank him, first of all, for joining us. Regretfully, Dr. Sands is not able to join us today. She had a sudden change in her schedule that made it impossible to join. So Dr. Chaudhury will be presenting today for the entire session. And I'm actually excited because that gives him a little time to dig deeper and tell us more about the fantastic global history of millets through the lens of history. So thank you, Dr. Chaudhury. I'll let you introduce yourself and tell our members here a little bit about your background. You have a very fascinating life and very fascinating scope of education and practice. And I know our listeners are very excited to hear all about this.
Thank you very much. I think as part of that, let me start sharing my screen, and then I will sort of start in that way. So I am Abed Chaudhury. My claim to millet, I guess, is that I've been a millet grower and collector over many years. I started my education by studying molecular biology and genetics in University of Oregon in Eugene. And then I continued on to the biology department at MIT, where I started working on plant biology. And then I settled on working continuously in plant biology and rice genetics and particularly millet collection and the history of millet was part of my career for the last 20 years or so. And as part of that, in the year 2000, starting 2003, actually 20 years, I was invited to give a talk in the Sloan School of Business at MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where they study user-led innovation as opposed to researcher-led innovation. So I pointed out to them that agriculture, especially ancient agriculture, was an example of user-led innovation that started tens of thousands of years ago. And the reason that is innovation as opposed to random thing, because in organized science, in structural science, there is a tendency to think of ancient varieties as part of nature, as though nobody with any agency or forethought created them. They've just been floating around. This kind of thinking permeates all of science even today. But this is completely opposite to what is the reality. If you look into these varieties, particularly millet, which are the most ancient ones, you see very powerful thought in genetics and so on. So I was very intrigued by that. And I'm very happy to give this talk as part of my thinking over the last 20 years in a very esteemed body such as an AMA on millet, and particularly centered around the question that is millet the most ancient domesticated crop? And obviously I think it is, so I'll continue in that vein. So if we want to sort of jump in quickly, we ask the question, what is millet? And millet there's a lot of confusion around the word millet. Some people call and ask me, is quinoa a millet? Is grain amaranth a millet? You know, what is a millet and what is not a millet? Interestingly, in the areas where millet is very preponderant, in the areas of millet domestication, if you will, people tend not to use the word millet. People use words like bajra, for instance, which is a which is a kind of a change from the name Barja, which is the name of rice, the Berej or Viriji. And then millet is sometimes called arzan, which is kind of play on the word rice or arroz. In my own part of the world, and the variety that I started to collect is called kaon, which is an altered form of the word corn, which simply meant grain. Corn was grain, and kaon was kind of a related word to corn. And one of the dish, and this kind of alludes to ancient nature of and linkage of millet with China, that one of the dishes called kaon zhao, or now widely known as congee, which you see everywhere in Asia, which is used to be made with millet. So these kind of words, I'm kind of a interested person in etymology and lexical structure and how words kind of carry culture around. So I became very fascinated by the multiple name of millets and what it meant, and I will touch a bit on that. So there are 18 domesticated and cultivated species of millet, and probably numerous undomesticated, still lingering around. And they have been domesticated in every continent, and I've given these references and sent over the slides as well. So if you're interested in looking up these papers. And the earliest, in terms of human prehistory or antiquity, the earliest millet, I think, is the Australian continent millet that I live in Canberra. But today I happen to be in Bangladesh, my birth country. But the Australian millet grasses are still the Australian food. And given that Australian people, there's a carbon dating study of Mungo Man of 60,000 years ago. So Australian Aboriginals represents continuous habitation of 60,000 of modern people. And they have their millet. So unless we can prove that they didn't have millet 60,000 years ago, we have to accept that represent that most ancient millet, which continues to be grown even today. So before I do that, I want to add a personal note, and because one of the issues that people always say that when was some cooking pots were discovered, and that is some kind of a signpost in time of when people became civilized enough to start using cooking pots, and there's a lot of talks like that in papers. And I'm just showing you something I did recently. I was visiting Bangladesh with my daughter-in-law, and I let her participate in this super ancient ritual long before the discovery of cooking pots, where rice and millet used to be cooked inside the bamboo. So you just fill up the bamboo with rice, millet, sorghum, what have you, and you burn it. And then after a while, you peel off the bamboo, and she's doing that with the help of one of my farmer friends. And you can see that this happens to be broken rice because we didn't have enough millet. And we had planted all the millet. So, but this is done, and this used to be done, God knows when, time immemorial, when people were cooking in bamboos. And then I went to recently a restaurant in Singapore, and I found very similar things done in leaf that you can see on the left. So the only reason I raise this issue here, that when you think of millet, you have to think of antiquity. You have to think of probably going back to the time when Homo sapiens mated with Neanderthals and Denisovans. We cannot put a day and say this is when millet was domesticated. I think millet is a kind of a crop that has not been domesticated, undomesticated way it's been grown. And you can see in the very nature of millet itself, the genetics suggest that it hasn't been actually domesticated. It's just been picked and people are growing it. So this is the Australian millet, which is at the moment called bush food because the people are still growing it. It's a hermaphrodite flower, which means that male and female are on the same part of the flower. And it's a staple food of Aboriginal people in the outback. And native millets are still being grown, and they're in continuous use, and they're part of the bush. They're called bush food in Australia. So I would like to suggest that this millet, Australian millet, which is called the decompositum, Panicum decompositum, represents the earliest known millet. Then I come to Africa, because Africa is a super ancient place of millet growth, and you see it kind of, I call it ML, myth and legend. So this millet name kind of goes with it. So when you start talking about millet, you're not talking about science. You're also talking about myths and legends. So there is a great African story, the Loma, excuse me, Loma, the goddess, and her two millets. And you can look up, it's a very interesting story. So Aboriginal people, of course, in here I'm still showing in Australian Aboriginal people growing millet, but moving on to the story of Africa. So if we think of Africa, there is the pearl millet, which is known in India as bajra, and it's the Penicitum glaucum, which originates in Africa. Then there is a finger millet originating in Africa. Fonio is originating in the Sahel region, and the black fonio, as well as Guinea millet. So these are African millets. They are deeply ingrained into the psyche of the very early human habitation, as we know, probably 70 to 80,000 years ago, anatomically modern humans walked out of Africa. And I would like to suggest, and there are clear evidence also, that they were having millets even before they came out of Africa. So it is very endemic in Africa. Now I come to China, and the reason I come to China, kind of jump to China from Africa, there are thousands of years separated. I think it's evidence, perhaps not carbon dating, but there are cultural evidence that Africa, obviously people were having millet 30, 40,000 years ago. But China is important because there is very solid carbon dating evidence in particular areas of China, which I'm showing here by the Yellow River. And there is a very clear evidence of 11,000 before present growth of wild foxtail millet and the millet that we call now proso millet. And one of the very powerful cultural evidence of proso millet originating from China is that all over South Asia, proso millet is called China, which means just China. So even in India, which is a very gung-ho nation about millet, they have no option but to call the proso millet, also known as broomcorn millet, simply as China. And I'll show that script of that very soon. So this is kind of assorted. I got it from the social media. There is a lot of kind of millet nationalism, as I would like to call it, coming from India. India is more than any other country declared, which is really something appreciated, that this is the year of the millet, and laid out all the millets. And you can see the proso at the bottom, and in Hindi it is written China. So proso is called China. And the above proso is the foxtail millet, which in Bangladesh in Hindi is written Kangni, and we call it kaon in Bangladesh. And I looked up the etymology of the word kaon, and it's nothing but corn. So the word corn became kaon, and corn simply means grain. So this is a very ancient Indo-European word that people started to use very early on. They had a generic name for these, whether it's wheat, whether it's sorghum or what have you. They used to call it collectively corn, meaning grain. And the related word in ancient Farsi is called dana. So you hear a lot about the word dana. So this laid out all the millet. I obviously something like quinoa, which probably ought to be a millet as well, is not included in here, but sorghum is very important. I've started working on sorghum for a long time and developed new varieties of sorghum over the years. I'll talk about it. Then there is pearl millet, which is known as bajra, and finger millet known as ragi. Interestingly, ragi is an ancient word for rice in Greek, and that kind of Indo-European linguistic etymology Ragi simply means rice. So often sorghum, the name of sorghum is deeply entwined with rice. So in China, for instance, foxtail millet is called zhao mi, and mi is rice and zhao is little. So it's zhao mi is just little rice, and that is the Chinese name for foxtail millet, and so on and so forth. So you see the antiquity, if you look into antiquity, excepting Australia, which is super ancient, when you come to Africa and then beyond Africa into China, you can start to see the Central Asian, Chinese, South Asian, Indian, all connection reflected in the way the words have been chosen to describe millet. And I kind of went into this a bit. So, the word bajra is actually, sometimes this consonant gets shifted. So it's actually barji, I think, because baraj means Viriji is the ancient name for rice. And the V got dropped and became Richi. And that's how, Oriza and all this rice name came. And in a lot of these millet, there are these rice derivative words. So one way to think about it, I mean, superficially, it looks like millet came into picture after rice, because then people say, oh, this is little rice. But it's not like that. Obviously, millet is much, much predating rice. But people became very fond of rice and start to name them by calling them little rice and so on. And the word risi, rice, was also used like corn, like in a generic sense as grain. So you see name like einkorn, which is one of the earliest varieties of wheat, is called einkorn. And and proso millet is also called broom corn. So people kind of gave this corn name and rice name to millets. Now, if we look into at the moment, the production of millet, you see India topping it, and there are rest of the countries are mostly in Africa, except for China. And we are looking forward to the day when the United States and Australia will be major millet producers. So I want to just quickly show you some pictures and point out to you. So this finger millet, I grew a lot of finger millet, and I was quite fascinated by the finger shape of the inflorescence. And to me, this indicates a very powerful selection and interesting phenotypic selection of a finger that was executed by very ancient people. And that stays on. So this is not some kind of random thing which happened to be in nature. This is the result of human breeding going into thousands of years ago, probably 20, 30,000 years ago. And then you have the Setaria family, the foxtail, which are reminiscent of the foxtail grasses that you can see around. So in my area, Bharat area in Bangladesh, there are foxtail grasses. And sometimes you can't differentiate between the actual foxtail millet and foxtail grasses. And you can almost feel like you're walking at a time when some wise person took one of the grasses and collected it, and that became the so-called domestication. But really, the grasses are all around, so there are many millet-like. And even in my childhood in the 60s, I've seen tribal women walking long distances and collecting some of these grass seeds and then grinding it up, etc. And I'm kind of going a bit ahead of myself, but I want to foreshadow you the word milling or grinding is deeply integrated to the word millet. And millet also in that sense, millet is something that you grind. So that mill word is very ancient Indo-European word, and also gave us the word in English language, mill. So rice mill. So when you say you are milling rice, you are kind of milleting rice. So that millet and mill is deeply ingrained. I want to point out to you the Panicum millesium, which is the name of millet come from, on the top right, and that's the broom corn or proso millet. In all over bulk of Asia is simply called China, because that is the crop that was domesticated in China and used to be a major crop in China 12, 13,000 years ago, as well as foxtail millet. And then you have pearl millet, which is the Penicillium locum, which is called bajra, which is a bit like rice in the nomenclature. So then, you can go on. And honestly, I haven't decided exactly when something is millet and when something is not millet, because these are widely different varieties, different genus, different species, connected with the thread that these are kind of subsistence food. They're not the mainstream food. They are not the rice and wheat and corn of the world, but they are often at the moment food of the marginal people. So this Digitaria cruciata, or the Raishan millet, is still grown in the hilly areas of my part of the world, including, so this Khasi Hills is exactly where I'm sort of now, near in Bangladesh and India as well. And the tribal people use this particular millet, as well as people in Vietnam. And I'll come back to the point of Vietnam very soon. And they have name, and again, Iburu, which means hungry rice. So this rice theme keeps coming in. And these semantic or lexical linkage, the linkage of words, which has nothing to do with science conventionally, is very important tool that has been for me to truly understand the connectivity and the cultural history and the ancient origin of millet. Again, a lot of foxtail type grass, Setaria species, etc. These are millet. These pictures are my own. So I grew a lot of finger millet, marveling at the inflorescence structure of the fist, of the fingers. And I thought of doing some mutagenesis and creating some alternate structures in there. It looks as though it hasn't been interrupted over tens of thousands of years. And as a geneticist, my instinct was just to interrupt and change it a bit and get into a new kind of phase. But I haven't done it yet. On the left, you can see my pearl millet. One phenotype of millet I'm very interested in is to make them perennial, because I think these crops used to be perennial, and the human beings over thousands of years selected the annual or the seasonal variety, make them very short. So foxtail goes from seed to seed in 6 weeks, which is the fastest growing cereal crop. But I wanted to deprogram that domestication trait and make them perennial, so they are around and giving repeated crops. And I've been successful in making pearl millet and sorghum give about 4 crops so far, spanning through the year, and I'm attempting to completely perennialize them. And you can see that pearl millet in my field, where we have cut back, and you're looking into second, sometimes third crops. So I have said a bit about it. So, you see this ML word, mill, and then amyl is starch in Greek. So a lot of Indo-European word, millet word, entered into Greek language and became part of English. MR is an example of a amyl corn, which is an ancient form of wheat, like spelt. And then it sort of continues on into a lot of mallet. When you have a small wooden hammer, you mallet it. And that ML word, which also means to render something smooth and kind of pulverize it. So there is a word called malayam, which means to make it very smooth, and as well as malleable. So millet-related words have just permeates all the Indo-European languages, including English. And you can go on and on. I particularly like the English word mill, and how mill has become a synonym of any machine, and originated with the process of pulverizing something, which is related to the word millet. So in coming back to the issue of China, it's domestication, very clear evidence that it happened 10,000 years ago, around the same time that rice was being domesticated in southern China. And a number of scholars, and I've given those citations here, they have hypothesized, and that makes a lot of sense, that when people were nomadic hunter-gatherers or foragers and so on, initially people did not have any starchy food. So they had gourd is the first vegetable to be domesticated. They had kind of non-cereal food supplemented by collection of these grass seeds. And this is when millet became very prominent. So this would be like 25, 30,000 years ago. around the time when human beings were mating with Denisovans and Neanderthals and introducing those genes into the human genome. And it would be very interesting, though it hasn't happened yet, I'm kind of very ambitious in this direction, is to find some evidence of millet degrading enzyme entering into our genes, maybe from the Denisovans or Neanderthals, looking into the human genome for evidence of specifically millet consuming or millet degrading enzymatic signature. But if you want to go by carbon dating, this is kind of the past that you go to, which is 12,000 years ago. Our other presumptive speaker, which I assume she's from Egypt or has link with Egypt. So Egyptian, it's not in the slide, but I should say that. So in Arabic, millet is called dokan and also dura, which is a sorghum. And going back into that Semitic culture, it's part of the Hebrew Bible, which I'll come to in a minute. So broomcorn millet, again, the site of broomcorn millet in China, Tibet region, and the Satirica species, which is the finger millet. Very, very, very good geographical evidence, very tight, good literature, and I have cited it. So my talk is kind of a composite of, some semantic connection, cultural connection, as well as very hard science of the origin of millet. Here I'm showing you the Vietnam, Thailand region, where also foxtail millet has been discovered of very ancient origin in the Neolithic time in Vietnam as well, and there's a corresponding paper on that. And then someone has studied the relative use of, this is in Vietnam, relative use of rice and other crops, and when this millet started to happen. So there is a chronology about 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, suddenly millet becomes prominent. So I think in different regions, the domestication and here you're talking about large scale agriculture where crops were grown and left their remnants. It's not just it doesn't indicate when people actually start to first use it or something, because that kind of evidence would be very difficult to pin down. That goes into antiquity, unrecorded past history. But then you have a more organized agriculture where massive amount of husks have remained that you can carbon date. And that comes sort of centers around the 10, 12,000 years. And in Vietnam, it's about 5,000 years. So then, me or any kind of scientifically minded person has a tradition of going by carbon dating. You cannot use a cultural, words to build up a specific time, other than to say that it goes into antiquity. So that is happening at the time when the major crops in the Fertile Crescent has not been domesticated yet, and suggests a time of hunter-gathering, a little bit of agriculture happening, probably driven by millet cultivation, going over tens of thousands of years, is basically what I would like to say. Nomadic tribes were growing millet, and because as I've myself seen, the foxtail millet gives you a crop in 6 weeks. And if you're a nomadic person, you want to move on, you don't want to grow rice or wheat, you want to grow millet. So this is what people did as they moved around in their long peregrination, originating from Africa. Probably they picked up millet, traveled through Central Asia, mated with the Denisovans and Neanderthals, tracked through the Central Asia, turned northwards, crossed the Bering Strait, went to America about 15,000 years ago, and all the way down to Peru. And people's skeleton have been discovered with their domesticated dog and gourd musical instrument in about 15,000 years ago. So the people who went to America that we now call American, Native Americans, or however you want to call it, Cherokees and Navajos and Sioux people, they're all Asian people. They trekked through Central Asia about 15, some people say 25,000 years ago. And they certainly took with them the crop. I mean, why wouldn't they? They were already, modern people. So we can kind of make it a bit fiction, I guess, here and try to put in the thing. So I want to come back to the picture I showed before. I think one of the way I have addressed this issue is to look into the cultural practices that are still there. So this is my own village, but we are kind of semi-tribal people. So the history of my own family is that people came from Central Asia, settled, and married into a tribal family, which are of Central Asian origin. And a lot of these practices, such as cooking your meal in a bamboo, still remains. Cooking your meal in a leaf and then steaming it still remains, and tells you what is real and what could have happened thousands of years ago. So I covered those points. Again, going back to China, I'm kind of overdid a bit, I guess, in order to dig up every conceivable paper, and in fact deployed my own satellite capability that I have to look into that Yellow River region and this area around Qishan, and I'm looking forward to even visiting those early millet cultivation areas, which has been preserved very well in China, actually. So now I want to come up to millet and poetry. So millet is one crop, and one thing I should say here, that there are a concept of 8 foundational crop. Unfortunately, millet is not included in it. I don't know why. It has 2 kind of wheat, the emmer wheat and the einkorn wheat. And then there are pulses and beans and so on. So this canonical 8 foundational crop, if you Google it, you don't see millet included. However, millet has been talked about and put into the cultural landscape through a lot of poetry. And just wanted to cite you how poets have used it. This one is a poet called Archibald Lampman. He wrote a lot about millet. He was obsessed with millet. And then there is a poet coming originally from Central Asia. He's of Zoroastrian. This is kind of pre-Islamic Persian culture. And he's a Zoroastrian background poet. And he wrote a very touching poem about how you grind millet and how the mother or the woman is good at it because she puts some cloth into it, because otherwise it just scatters everywhere. So millet is pounded along with cloves. And then what do you do with this cloves, which has bits of millets remaining? It's just fascinating, very touching poem, actually, centered around role of women. So mom's trick, excellent, held the shells in place. She took pieces of cloth and threw in mortar and then hammered, hit, smashed with handle right on the skin's head. So, and she goes on and on, he goes on and on. So I couldn't but help to indicate some of the, I know I'm not supposed to talk about food, but millet-derived food is just everywhere. And in my country, in the villages, there is congee, which is a watery way of cooking millet. In Singapore, I was in Singapore yesterday. In the breakfast, people are having congee, which is actually congee. So it is done with foxtail millet. And in Bangladesh, in the villages, not the modern people have left millet behind because they think it's poor people's food in this country. But there is a lot of dessert made of millet. So in the Hebrew Bible, it says, I'm very happy that modern scientists did not include millet in the 8 foundational crop, but in Hebrew Bible, in Ezekiel 4:9, it says that, and you take wheat and barley, beans and lentils, millet and emmer, which is an earlier form of wheat, in single vessel and make your bread from them, etc. So God is asking the prophet on how to make bread. I wanted to show you my little development here. So here's my farmer friend wearing the University of Iowa sweatshirt, and he's holding a sorghum variety that I have developed with his help. And this is an immensely tall sorghum variety. And what you're looking at is the 3rd crop. So we have engineered, or not really genetically modified or anything in that sense, but bred through repeated backcrossing a variety of sorghum, which can now give repeated crop upon cutting. And this particular one is important because it's immense, and I wanted this to get very tall so that it attracts attention. And you're looking at its 3rd crop now, which is more than the 1st crop. So it has been harvested once, harvested twice, and now you're looking at the 3rd harvest, which is a very significant thing. And on the right, this particular one happens to be wheat, but I'm also working on non-millet ancient crops, I guess, such as barley and wheat. And then there's a whole bunch of reference to what I've just said, and I passed on the slide for your benefit. I think I will end here and take the questions.
Wow, Dr. Chaudhury, that was a fantastic presentation. And so I know many of you, yeah, thank you so much. I have questions, and clearly I'm not looking at my phone since I'm driving today. But if Sophia, who is one of our fantastic interns at University of Missouri, I'm going to pass it over to her to help facilitate Q&A for the rest of our time together.
I think we only really had one question. Let me find it. So one of the questions was, what are the average yields for those? She was talking about the perennialized millets, and then how many years have you been able to harvest those?
Yeah, so I try to call it multi-harvest rather than perennialized, because perennialized implies that it is going through the year, through the winter. So in our case, we take a crop which normally gives just only one major crop. And there is a genetic pathway that I work with in a very specific way. So it's not a generic thing, it's a very specific thing. And I can make it give second and particularly very powerful third harvest, which exceeds the first harvest. And then it automatically follows into another 2 more harvests, which are a bit weaker. So we call it Pancha Brihi, which is Brihi is the ancient name of rice. And Pancha Brihi means 5 times rice, 5 times millet, first time, 5 times sorghum. So I can talk and this has been, I'm doing it in parallel. So it basically increases the yield by factor of 3. So whatever you see in the literature, 3 tons per hectare, let's say per year, would become 9 tons per hectare per year. In that marginalized poor farmer kind of situation. I'm sure in a place like Iowa with modern agronomy and everything, it will be a lot more, but I haven't introduced them to US yet.
Matt, did you have a question?
Yes, I did. I just had a quick follow-up for that one. Do you have a sense of like, or at least what in your trials, what the, I don't know, I'm not a scientist for crops, but like what the frequency, or how much time between each harvest after that first harvest? I'm just thinking about like how this could fit into a rotation.
Yeah, so the second harvest is super quick. So if you talk about foxtail millet, which is very fast anyway. So when you cut it, literally like 2-3 weeks later, you get another crop. In case of rice, it takes normal rice life cycle is 120 days, but when you cut, you get the harvest in another 45 days. So it happens to be half or 1/3 of the life cycle, depending on the weather and depending also the kind of fertilizer. So there is a great deal of variation with respect to the agronomy. So part of it is genetics. These are mutant, if you will, of the conventional ones, which are repeatedly regenerable, but they're also highly responsive to a fertilizer spray that we developed, as well as the manner of cutting, whether you cut at the bottom or you cut at the top. So there is a whole kind of multi-harvest compliant agronomy that I could probably give a separate talk on, but roughly that is the situation. We were very successful with sorghum because sorghum has this powerful capacity. These are actually not totally domesticated crop, the millet group, the sorghums and the foxtail millet. They are not entrenched. They're not like wheat. They have still remained kind of undomesticated, and you can, what we in biology call plastic. So this plasticity of their behavior and development seems very obvious.
If I may interject here, there was a question from Claire, Dr. Chaudhury, pertaining to the perennial millets. And the question is, what variety was the type of millet that had 3 harvests per year? Was it pearl millet?
No, it was foxtail millet, and we are doing it in proso. We are doing it in proso millet. In pearl millet, we have done it, but we haven't gotten a large third harvest yet. You got a very significant second harvest, but we got a very powerful third harvest in sorghum.
Okay,
And then,
I'd also, I'm sorry. I
you're
just
fine.
wanted to
Go
point
ahead.
out that Makiko Taguchi from the FAO pointed out that millets, I know Dr. Chaudhury made a reference to, he's not, too picky on what you call a millet or is not, but Makiko said that in the FAO, if I saw that correctly, you only are including members of the POA family as millets. Is that correct? Poaceae, right.
Well, foxtail millet is eternally millet, and it's a setaria. It's not you can call it a poa, I guess.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure. Some people say, yeah, why shouldn't quinoa be millet? And one of the local quinoa in my village, which is not a South American quinoa, but nonetheless a quinoa, and looks exactly like quinoa in fluorescence. And some people call it bajra, ancient nomenclature for millet. So I think in people's mind, and grain amaranth also have this millet-like name. So if you go by cultural definition that people have imposed, sometimes these quinoas have also been described as millet. But then scholars might come with a genus species-based nomenclature, which is different.
Okay, we still have about 20 minutes here. If anybody can ask any question they like.
There was one more question in the
Oh,
chat.
okay.
Where
Okay.
can we find millet seeds that grow in the US?
Okay.
Say that again, I didn't get that, sorry. Yeah.
Where can we find millet seeds that can grow in the United States?
Oh, well, I think it's only regulated by quarantine and the introduction of varieties to the US, which is very standard procedure, because what I have developed is available for public domain for the researchers or even commercial growers, because I'm not interested in kind of creating a intellectual property regimen around the work that I do, particularly millet, because I think millet is so ancient and so kind of culture bound in my mind that whatever I do in millet improvement, I make it available, widely available to everyone.
Yeah, I think if Don can back me up on this a little bit. I think a source to begin to look for millet seeds in the US is maybe the USDA experiment station in the state of Georgia, associated with the University of Georgia, or something like that. Is that correct, Don?
There's another.
Yeah.
Yeah,
A lot of pearl millet and sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say a lot of sorghum and pearl millet in particular, they're hybrids, they're modern hybrids. So they have been bred not to be like the traditional varieties, which is good and bad depending on your, because they're often forage grasses, they're for birds and so on. So I think different people have imposed their own over fairly recently, last 40 years, let's say. And so sometimes you get some of those modern varieties, you don't get the old varieties anymore. So I made a collection of getting all the traditional old varieties over a period of time, and I'm kind of a custodian of older varieties.
Yeah, the question of seeds for millets in the US and Canada and Mexico for that matter is a little bit complicated. First of all, there are several millets that are grown, but not for grains. Obviously, you're not thinking of that when you're asking that question, I'm sure. The grain-bearing varieties, there are grain-bearing varieties, and then there are food-bearing grain-bearing varieties. And then you have to consider adaptation to particular climate zones in terms of daylight length and temperature and so on. So, but there apparently are no varieties of food-grade grain-bearing millets available for this part of the world, other than proso, teff, and sorghum, of course. but those could be developed. Maybe some things internationally could be imported, but then as Dr. Chaudhury mentioned, it's a question of how to, the phytosanitary limitations and so on. But it's a little bit, unfortunately, complicated to get certain varieties. So a lot of times be specific and we can see what we can find. We're not suppliers, but we can help troubleshoot.
Yeah, it's very important point, because some of the traditional varieties, they still have tannins and phytoalexins and the colored compounds. And some people culturally don't like it. They kind of breed out the color and make it super white. So a lot of these modern varieties are like that, and the traditional varieties still retain the color, which is considered nutritionally very important these days for metabolic syndrome and all those things. So millets are extremely important for food for diabetics, because it has a sugar retarding or sugar glycemic retardant, if you will, which does not allow blood sugar to go up. And obviously traditional people have used this as a device of glycemic control, because suddenly you see this big explosion of diabetes around the world when people have shifted to wheat-based starch and rice-based starch and moved away from millet-based starch. So millet can be a major pillar of the new nutraceutical food, I think, and can be categorized as a superfood that everyone should have every day, a bit.
Thank you. That's very interesting. I think Gary Wheatcraft had both a comment and a question about the availability of seed. If you saw in the comments, he says, look online for seed companies that sell various species of millet in the US, including Proso. Foxtail pearl, they're commonly available in Colorado and South Dakota. But his question was for Dr. Chaudhury, what is the earliest date of confirmation of millet in Australia?
You mean in terms of radiocarbon dating and so on? If you follow that Aboriginal people and their lifestyle, foraging lifestyle is as ancient as the first available evidence of humanity, which is 60,000 years ago, then you have to say, well, that Mongo man, was he growing millet? I mean, that's not a question that we can answer, but we can say that this group of people 30,000 years ago, very, very safely, you can say we're growing millet. So when I looked into this whole antiquity issue, the conclusion is very clear. The Australia represents a very clear millet usage, but then Africa is the birthplace of humanity. So even before they trekked out of Africa and went to Australia, they were probably growing millet, and I have no evidence against it.
Since we have about 12 minutes, hello everyone, it's Molly. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, you're breaking up a little bit, Molly.
Okay, yeah, so I am in the parking lot. Well, the kids, both daughters, swim practice activity as usual, Eastern time. So yeah, is it better now? Is it better now?
Sure.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So again, Dr. Chaudhury, thank you so much for the presentation. Really appreciate it. Again, this question is not specifically for Dr. Chaudhury, but in general, I have attended the first session last month from NAMA, and then I'm trying to see the objective. Is it really for like educational purposes, awareness? Is that what we are trying to kind of bring to these? This is the third session, or rather I should say third presenter so far this year. So, and I would like to continue attending these sessions, but I was kind of lost when it comes to what's the objective. Is it all like educational purposes, or do we want to bring up the questions related to how can we do export, how can we do import of millets and so forth? I'll stop there. Again, anyone, I'm not sure, Mr. Osborne or Gary, well, Don.
Let me try something, and Don can tell me what I missed. I think, Muli, did you receive the notes from the last huddle meeting? I think there is. I might have included the list of topics for upcoming webinars, and there's something in there about marketing. So it's a big question. and when we first thought about creating NAMA, we thought about why are we doing this, but really fundamentally, we're trying to promote the wider consumption of millets in North America, basically. But that obviously involves growing it, distributing it, and appealing to consumers' tastes as well. Don, you want to add to that at all?
Yeah, that's basically it. It's promoting millets, and that promoting it, first of all, is educational, informational, because they're not well known in this region, outside of a small number of people who have experience with them for various reasons. And then after, when you talk about promoting it, also there are practical aspects. So if there are businesses that are trying to incorporate millets in their operations, they have to deal with questions like milling and so on. So there are practical aspects, and all of that does, it impinges on whether there's going to be consumer demand. So we want to, part of the educational aspect is also enticing people to try them. In general, I think our impression is that twofold, take a larger picture, considering that a lot of millets are grown for animal feed here, quite a considerable amount, or for other agricultural purposes, for rotation crops and so on. And that is that in this region, we will be growing more millets for diverse purposes, including, but not limited to, human food. And we're also going to be consuming more millets of diverse types, many of which are imported. So we're really interested in trying to understand that, trying to facilitate it on all angles. This is really a work in progress. We're kind of figuring out a lot of things as we're going. We're networking, learning as we go. The Millets webinar series is an education for us as well as for you all. I mean, Dr. Chaudhury's presentation brought information to me that I wasn't aware of. Yeah, the sequence of topics we have in the webinar are intended to try to touch base on a number of different aspects of why millets are interesting for our future.
Mm-hmm. That's right. And Matt Goldstein just published on the chat a similar response, Muli. We're kind of trying to start either big or small, depending on how you look at it, but then move to more pragmatic issues having to do with marketing, obviously, processing, which is really important, equipment needed, and things like that, availability. And it's the International Year of the Millet that inspired us to start doing this, but we're looking further beyond this year and seeing if we can just keep at it and increase the demand for consumption of any of the millets that Dr. Chaudhury has mentioned today.
Yep.
One thing I quickly wanted to mention here is that there's the issue of branding, because often in literature I see millets are described as animal food and so on. So I think this is completely in contrast to what actually happens in the areas of domestication, where they're highly prized human food. They're not animal food. So, and if you look into the language in Farsi and Arabic, durra, dokhan, arzan, or in my own country, the kaon, these are highly powerful emotive words, strongly suggesting these are human food of very high value. And then you see some random, and these days in Google search, it shows up when somebody has decided that this is an animal food. That is a very hurtful thing that goes against the current trend where people are trying to bring millet as a valid human food. You suddenly have this kind of branding. I know it's a free country, so no one can stop it, but we have to kind of combat it with our equally enthusiastic narrative and story building and so on.
Yeah,
exactly.
So I
Thank you.
I kind of agree with the Dr. Chaudhury, because to be honest with you, I thought that since being originally from India and knowing that millets have been predominantly the main staple diet in the past, let's not get into how many years ago and so forth, but let's just call it in the past. So I thought, okay, how about it is definitely a human grain that we could use. But when I went to, I'm based out of the Raleigh area here, and then I went to a Southern Farm Show just couple of weeks ago. And when I started talking about the millets, and they really consider millet as an animal food. And like, now, okay, all right, that's fine. Doesn't matter who is going to eat it. Let's just be focused on that. But how is millet going to compete with corn, which is about 25 cents approximately the price per kilo? I mean, they sell it in bushels, but that's fine. Even if I try to convert that into kilos, so it's 25 cents per kilo, but millet is nowhere near that, the price, even if we want to import it. So it's a twofold thing. We are trying to educate in US for human consumption, and then the farmers are going to question it. How many of the individuals they really know about millet? So yeah, I mean, it is getting very tough. I tried my best to make them understand. There were only 2 booths who were interested in talking to me about millets here. So I'll stop there. I'm sure there are others who might be willing to chime in with same.
Well, those are very good points. Go ahead.
Yeah, they are. I'd love to chime in real quick, you guys, because I think that this just speaks so well to like the longevity of the vision of how we're going to create a category around millets. Because when you do consider it, it is a category creation play in the market, in the consumer facing market. And to make that fundamental shift to human grade and human grade focused agronomy, like we talked about, lots of different things are going to happen simultaneously. First is that just getting everyone to the same party is huge, because there's a lot of millet innovation happening across the North America, but it's largely happening in silos. So like agronomists and geneticists and market innovators and product developers, they don't often get into the same room, and then they don't talk to farmers. So like I have a lot of farmers that come to me because they're like, hey, look, we have to grow these millets because they're an integral part of our rotation, but we just roller crimp them, or maybe we sell them into the animal food markets. And there's a strong need to help monetize those cover crops with a value stream that's of human grade, so that there's like a incentive, from a financial perspective. So I think as the health awareness grows around millets, that's going to help. And we are establishing focus groups, and they're not going to be working focus groups yet, but we're going to be accumulating people who are going to be focused on specific functions that need to happen to build this category. And so if you've not accessed that folder, please ping me, and I'll make sure that you have access to it. And we can start to get some of our heavy hitters from the marketing side of things, like Claire at Tafola, me at Snacktivist, because I own a consumer facing brand that sells millets. How do we get the word out, and how do we start having those other conversations? I'd like to have some panels later this year specifically focused on these different topics. Thank you.
Yes.
It's very important two-track strategy. One is that millet is a superfood because it's essential to combat the diabetes pandemic and obesity and everything. That is point number 1. Point number 2 is deeply rooted in human cultural history. So the word ragi, one of the Indian millet called ragi, is the same word as rice or rai. These are the root words. So I think this semantic knowledge also helps to build a kind of a new improved story around millet.
Very good. There's a good comment there by Gary about when the price of millet is right for farmers to grow. We'll send notes around to everybody who's here and other people who have participated on all these comments. But we're running out of time. I want to, and we all do, all of us involved in NAMA and everyone here attending, really want to express our deep thanks to Dr. Chaudhury for showing up today. It's like 3 or 4 in the morning or something like that. That's not easy. And it was so interesting what you had to say. It's really wonderful to have met you this way, and hopefully in person someday.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And thank you. Yeah, and thank you so much to University of Missouri for hosting, and to our fantastic interns, Dr. Karuva Krishnaswamy, and Dr. Rob Myers also for helping to make this all come to life. So very appreciative to all of you who are helping. And yeah, just please reach out to us, guys. There's also a form for anybody who has suggestions about other topics, and we're going to add a panels portion to that too. So yeah, let us know what you want to hear. That's partially what we're here for. So thanks for coming, everybody.
Take care.
Thank you. See you
Have a nice
next
evening.
time.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye-bye.
See you next month.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye bye. Thank
Bye.
you, everyone.